I never thought I would be the guy writing one of these stories. You know the kind. The husband finds out his wife cheated, the marriage falls apart, and suddenly thousands of strangers on the internet know more about his life than his own family does. But if someone told me a year ago that my wife would cheat on me with our gardener, I would have laughed. Not because I believed my marriage was perfect, but because of who the gardener was. His name was Carl. Carl was about 50 years old, at least 300 pounds, always sweating through the same faded green shirt, and he had the kind of face people forget 5 seconds after meeting him. He wasn't charming. He wasn't attractive. He barely spoke more than a few sentences when he worked. And yet somehow, he became the center of the worst discovery of my life. My wife Emily and I had been married for 8 years. We didn't have kids, but we had a comfortable life in a quiet suburb outside Seattle. I worked remotely in cybersecurity, which meant I spent most of my days upstairs in my office surrounded by monitors. Emily worked in marketing. She was confident, smart, and the kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention without even trying. I trusted her completely, which is why the first signs didn't register as warning signals. Carl had started working for us about 6 months earlier. A co-worker of Emily's recommended him because he was cheap and reliable. He came twice a week to mow the lawn, trim the hedges, and take care of the garden beds behind the house. At first, he was just background noise in our life, a truck in the driveway, the sound of a lawnmower outside, the occasional knock on the door when he needed access to the backyard. But about 3 months after he started working for us, something strange began to happen. Emily suddenly became interested in gardening, and I mean suddenly. Before that, she couldn't tell the difference between a tulip and a weed. Plants died the moment she touched them, but now she was outside almost every time Carl showed up, talking with him, laughing, asking questions about soil, fertilizer, and planting seasons like she was studying for a horticulture exam. The first time I noticed it, I was working in my office upstairs. My desk faced the window that overlooked the backyard. Carl was digging near the fence. Emily was standing next to him. At one point, she laughed so hard she leaned forward and touched his arm. That moment stuck with me for some reason, not because it looked romantic, it just looked unusual. Carl wasn't the kind of man women flirted with, and Emily wasn't the kind of woman who spent afternoons chatting with gardeners. But I ignored the feeling. Because what kind of husband gets jealous of a gardener? Then something happened that I still remember with perfect clarity. One afternoon, I went downstairs to grab coffee. Emily had left her phone on the kitchen counter. Right as I walked past it, a message appeared on the screen. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the preview showed one sentence that made my stomach tighten. Tomorrow, when he's upstairs again. I froze. There was no name saved for the contact, just a phone number. Before I could even process it, another message appeared. I'll bring the tools earlier. And suddenly something in my brain connected a detail I hadn't thought about before. Carl always talked about his tools, every single time he came over. I stood there staring at the phone for a long time, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. But the strange feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. So the next morning I did something I had never done in 8 years of marriage. Instead of working upstairs like usual, I grabbed my keys, kissed Emily goodbye, walked out the front door, got into my car, started the engine, and then quietly parked 2 houses down the street. Because for the first time in my life, I had the feeling that if I didn't check what was really happening behind that door, I might regret it forever. And 20 minutes later, Carl's truck pulled into the driveway. 5 minutes after that, Emily unlocked the back door. What happened next was the moment my entire marriage cracked open. But the truth is, the cheating wasn't even the worst part, because when I finally understood why Carl kept coming to our house, I realized my wife had been hiding something much bigger than an affair. I sat in the car for almost 5 minutes after Carl's truck arrived, My heart was beating so hard it felt ridiculous. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe Emily had asked Carl to help move something in the yard. Maybe the messages were about tools for the garden beds. There were dozens of innocent explanations. But something in my gut kept telling me to wait. So I did. Carl got out of his truck slowly, like always. He stretched his back, grabbed a small toolbox from the passenger seat, and walked toward the side gate that led to the backyard. That part looked normal. What didn't look normal was the fact that he didn't start the lawnmower. He didn't touch the bushes. He just disappeared behind the house. 2 minutes passed, then 3. No sound of work, no equipment, nothing. That was the moment I got out of the car. I walked down the street casually, like someone just taking a morning stroll. When I reached my house, I didn't go through the front door. I went through the side gate that led into the backyard, and the moment I stepped inside, I froze. The garden looked completely normal. Freshly cut grass, flower beds, the wooden shed near the back fence. But the back door to the house was slightly open, just enough to hear voices. Emily's voice, and Carl's. I moved closer without making noise. The words weren't clear at first, just muffled conversation. Then I heard Emily laugh, not the polite laugh she used with strangers, the real one, the one she used when we watched movies together late at night. My chest felt tight. I moved closer to the door. Carl said something I couldn't hear. Emily answered, "Relax. He always works upstairs at this time." I felt something cold run through my stomach. Carl replied, quieter this time, "What if he comes down?" Emily laughed again. "He won't." There was a pause. Then I heard something that made my hands start shaking. Footsteps, fast footsteps, and then the sound of the kitchen counter being bumped. I didn't need to see what was happening. I knew. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 20. Time felt strange in that moment. Part of me wanted to kick the door open and confront them right there, but another part of me didn't move. Because suddenly another detail caught my attention, something outside, behind me, near the garden beds. I turned around slowly, and that's when I noticed something strange. Carl had been digging earlier that week near the fence line. At the time, I thought he was planting new shrubs, but now I noticed the soil looked different, darker, fresh, and there were 3 small wooden markers stuck in the ground. They looked like plant markers, but there were no plants there, just dirt. I stared at them for a few seconds. Something about it felt wrong. Then the back door suddenly opened. I stepped behind the shed before anyone could see me. Carl walked outside first. He was breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his face. He looked around quickly, then he walked straight to the exact spot with the wooden markers. And this is the part I still can't explain. Carl knelt down, touched the dirt, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on his shorts, and walked back toward his truck. Emily never came outside. Carl drove away about a minute later. I waited another 10 minutes before going inside the house. Emily was sitting on the couch with her laptop open, like nothing had happened. She looked up at me, surprised. "I thought you left for work." I forced a smile. Forgot something. But the whole time we were talking, I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 markers in the garden. Because the cheating hurt. Of course it did. But something about Carl kneeling in that dirt made me feel like I had just walked into a story I didn't understand yet. And later that night, I went back to that exact spot with a flashlight, because I needed to know what Carl had buried in my backyard, and what I found under that dirt made the affair look like the smallest problem in my marriage. I waited until Emily went to sleep. That part wasn't difficult. She always fell asleep quickly, especially on weeknights. Around midnight, the house was completely silent. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for a long time, replaying everything that had happened that morning. Carl, the voices in the kitchen, Emily laughing. But the thing that kept replaying in my mind wasn't the cheating. It was Carl kneeling in the dirt next to those markers, the way he touched the soil, almost like he was checking on something or someone. Around 1 in the morning, I finally got out of bed. Emily was asleep beside me, breathing slowly, completely peaceful. If someone had walked into the room right then, they would have seen a perfectly normal couple sleeping in a perfectly normal house. But my brain wouldn't stop asking the same question. What the hell was buried in my garden? I quietly grabbed a flashlight from the hallway drawer and slipped outside through the back door. The night air was cold. Everything in the yard was still. Carl's work from earlier in the week was easy to spot. The soil near the fence line was darker and loose compared to the rest of the garden, and those 3 wooden markers were exactly where I remembered them. I walked over slowly. For a moment, I just stood there staring at them. Up close, they looked even stranger. They weren't labeled with plant names, just small scratch symbols, 3 simple lines carved into the wood, like someone marking positions. I pushed one of the markers aside with my foot. Then I started digging. At first it was easy. The soil was soft and freshly turned. My hands moved quickly, pulling away dirt, expecting to hit something within seconds. A box, a bag, anything. But after about a minute, I still hadn't found anything. Just dirt. I kept digging. The hole got deeper. 10 inches, then 12. My heart started pounding, because suddenly my fingers touched something. Plastic. I brushed away the dirt and pulled it out. It was a sealed plastic container, about the size of a lunchbox. My stomach twisted. For a second, I considered putting it back and pretending none of this had happened, but I had already come this far. So I opened it. Inside were several envelopes, all of them sealed, all of them with the same handwriting, Emily's. My chest tightened as I opened the first one. Inside was a stack of printed photos, photos of me. Dozens of them. Some were taken from inside the house, some from the yard, some from angles that made it clear they were taken without me knowing. My hands started shaking. I flipped through them quickly. Every photo had a date written on the back. The earliest one was almost a year old. Carl hadn't been our gardener for 6 months. He had been coming to the house much longer than that. Then I noticed something else inside the container. A folded piece of paper. I opened it slowly, and that's when the ground beneath me felt like it disappeared. Because it wasn't a note, it was a printed list, a schedule, my schedule, every day of the week, every hour I was home, every time I left the house, every time I worked upstairs, every time I went to the gym, every movement of my life, documented, studied, tracked. And at the bottom of the page, there was one sentence written in pen, in Emily's handwriting. Once everything is ready, we won't need him anymore. I stood there in the dirt, staring at that sentence, trying to understand what it meant, trying to convince myself there was some explanation that didn't involve the worst possibilities running through my head. Then suddenly a voice came from behind me, quiet, but clear. You weren't supposed to find that yet. I turned around slowly, and standing near the back door was my wife, watching me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Emily stood near the back door with her arms crossed, watching me like I had just interrupted something inconvenient rather than uncovered something terrifying. The flashlight in my hand shook slightly. You weren't supposed to find that yet, she repeated calmly. I looked down at the photos scattered in the dirt, pictures of me walking to my car, pictures of me working at my desk through the office window, pictures of me taking the trash out at night. My voice came out hoarse. What is this? Emily walked closer, stepping carefully around the hole I had dug. For a moment I thought she might try to deny everything. Instead, she sighed. You were always curious, she said. Eventually, you were going to notice something. Something in the way she said it made my stomach drop. Notice what? I asked. Emily looked down at the container and picked up one of the photos. You think Carl was just a gardener, she said, but Carl doesn't work for me. A cold feeling spread through my chest. What are you talking about? She held up the photo. He works for someone else. My brain struggled to keep up. Someone else, I repeated. Emily nodded. The company I work for. For a moment, the sentence didn't make sense. Then she continued. You think I work in marketing, she said. That's just what I told you. The night suddenly felt colder. Emily crouched next to the hole and picked up the schedule I had found. You were part of an evaluation. I stared at her. An evaluation? She nodded again. Our firm studies behavioral security risks. My head was spinning. What does that have to do with me? Emily looked directly at me. Everything. She tapped the paper. Your job in cybersecurity made you interesting to them. They wanted to see how predictable you were, how easy it would be to observe your routine. The words sounded insane. You're telling me your company hired a gardener to spy on me? Emily shrugged slightly. More or less. My chest tightened. And the cheating? For the first time, Emily hesitated. Then she gave a small, tired smile. That part wasn't part of the study. The sentence hit harder than anything else she had said. So, all of this, I gestured at the photos, the container, the dirt. This was a test? Emily nodded. You were supposed to stay predictable. And if I didn't? I asked quietly. She looked toward the dark fence behind the garden. Then the evaluation would change. Silence hung between us. Finally, I spoke again. You wrote we wouldn't need me anymore. Emily glanced at the sentence on the paper. Then she looked back at me. Yes, I swallowed. What does that mean? Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly closed the container and placed it back in the hole. Then she looked up at me again. Honestly, her voice was calm. Too calm. It means you weren't supposed to be here tonight. The words hung in the air. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then suddenly headlights swept across the backyard fence, a car pulling up in front of the house. Emily stood up slowly. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. Carl's truck had just returned. And this time, he wasn't alone. Carl's truck engine shut off. For a moment, nobody moved. The headlights from the street were still cutting across the yard, casting long shadows over the garden and the hole I had dug. Emily turned toward the gate. She didn't look surprised. She looked prepared. That realization hit me harder than anything else that night, because it meant she had expected this moment. Carl stepped through the side gate a few seconds later. But he wasn't alone. Two men walked in behind him. Neither of them looked like gardeners. Both wore dark jackets, clean shoes, and the calm posture of people who were used to being in control of situations. Carl didn't say a word. He just looked at the hole in the garden, then at the plastic container in Emily's hands, then at me. Well, he said slowly, that's earlier than planned. One of the men stepped forward. He looked at Emily. Did he read it? Emily nodded. Yes. The man turned his attention to me. His expression was neutral, almost bored. You weren't supposed to discover the container tonight, he said. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. What exactly was supposed to happen tonight? The man ignored the question. Instead, he looked at the schedule sheet still lying in the dirt. Your routine was extremely consistent, he said. Predictable behavior patterns make people easy to manage. I stared at him. You people have been watching me for a year. Carl scratched his beard. 14 months, he corrected. The number made my stomach twist. 14 months of photos, 14 months of tracking, 14